Okay, good morning. I'm going to continue part 2 of the Reshima that I began teaching last week. The Rebbe said and then edited and wrote on Yutes Iyar Tavshin Yud Beis. At the end of the Shiva, the Rebbe stood up from Shiva for his brother, Rabbi Yisrael Aryeh Leib. So it's printed, what I'm looking at now is printed in Likutei Sichos Chelik Chav Zayin, page 363 and 364. So we really covered the first paragraph and all the ha'aras there. And briefly, a number of chidushim of the Rebbe that you're not going to find elsewhere in Chassidus. And briefly the Rebbe said, and then we'll continue, that Habriya, the Briya, all of creation, all of existence, is a Yerida v'Yishtalshus Mamayil Lamato. Because of course the Eibishter is the creator, so he's the highest level. So anything he creates is going to be a lower level. And, right? And it's a process, what we call sometimes Ishtalshus, Yerida and Ishtalshus. I'm not going to go through all the details because we reviewed it last week, because the Rebbe explains the difference to Yerida and Ishtalshus. And what's the kavanah of it all? Not a Yerida l'shem Yerida. That's not the intention. The intention is a kavanah shetiyah acher kach aliyah acher aliyah mamata l'mayla. What we know, in other words, in the Savakos Baruch Aliyah Leis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim, I'm just using a different language. The Rebbe doesn't use that language here. So the Alter Rebbe explains in Perek Lamed Vav, why is it called Tachtenim? It's not Tachtenim in Mokim, because there's no Mokim. It's not a physical lowest. It's the Yerida Ishtalshelus, that in the Dagas of Gili Elikus and Helam of Elikus, Tachtenim is Tachten Shem Tachten Lamat Menu. We call it Tachtenim because there's the least revelation, the least Gili of Elikus, to the point of the Helam Behester Cheshach Kofla Mechupel, to the point that you even have the Klippus and Sitra Achre, all the Klippus and Sitra Achre, to the point they say Aniva Afsi Eid. But the Kavanah is Shaliyas Leis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim. In other words, the Kavanah is not Tachtenim just for Tachtenim, that's the Yerida. The Kavanah is that we should transform it into Adira. That means the Kavanah is there should be Aliyah Mamata L'Mayla Acher Aliyah Mamata L'Mayla. And since this is the Kavanah, and here's where there's a big chiddush here from the Rebbe, Harinasa came b'peil. Because you could say the Eibishter of the Kavanah, but maybe our Bechira stops the process. If we don't choose correctly, Chaz v'Shalom, so as much as the Eibishter's Kavanah was that it should be Aliyah Acher Aliyah, so the Rebbe says, no, you have to say that this will be Ezgifid for sure. And the long ha'ara that we learned, the Rebbe explained at length what that means and how Bechira works. He began by saying, Mi ma'akev ke'em ma'akev chaz v'shalom b'yodei. And then he continues to explain that Bechira is only regarding the matzovim shel haprotim. Aval eina mishanis es ha'sachakol shel ha'briya b'chlolusa. So the briya b'chlolusa, the kavanah should be aliyah. So that for sure is going to happen. Question is the matzah b'protim, how the details, and I explained this last week and last year. And deeper, the Rebbe said, he said that this is also true not just in Klolos Habriya. You could say Klolos Habriya will be an aliyah, but how it says every yachid. He said, he said, so even a person who may be becher Hepech, Chaz v'Shalom, Sof Kosov, there'll be an aliyah. And the question is only how much time it'll take. Like Zachu B'ita Achishanu, whether it's Zachu or Le Zachu. And then the Rebbe explains, so then what exactly does Bechira do? If at the end of the day, what's the Bechira? So, he said, B'chol zeh nenesh ha'becher kiva shalei zui kavanose. That nevertheless, the Becher will be punished for whatever he did wrong. He's accountable because his kavanah was not daliyah. His kavanah was he did something wrong. But the end of the story will be that there will be an aliyah. The shaila is whether it will come directly, let's say like tzaddikim, or it will come through tshuva. Or the Rebbe puts it that and he gave the example from Sefer HaMitzvahs, the mitzvah of Balmum, the Isra Balmum of a kohen bring a makriv as a Balmum is not allowed to bring a korban, and the mashal that we elaborated on, where you sometimes in Tachsisei Milchama, in the methods of war, strategies of war, sometimes you'll send out, one side will send out some of their military just to draw out the enemies to see the enemy. So meanwhile they're putting themselves in sakana, and they may even get hurt. But the goal is ultimately the nitzachon of the Milchama, as the Rebbe brings here. Okay. Difference between Bavli and Rishami. That's the ha'ara, and that sums up more or less, or just let me just finish the end of the paragraph. Okay, so now it's even a ish parati. So he says, Shema'oz nigmar ha'yirida ischila aliyah achar aliyah. So from the moment that the yirida finished, meaning creation finished right away, it says, it doesn't say right away, Ma'oz nigmar ha'yirida ischila aliyah achar aliyah el shebegoli nirizeh b'rishamas b'gan eden. So then why don't we see these aliyahs of the whole purpose of the yirida, of Bria, of Yishtalshul Yeridus and Yishtalshul Sabriya? So why don't you see the aliyah? He says you don't see it. You see it either in Gan Eden or in Tzaddikim, also in Eilam Hazeh, because Talmid Chacham Ein La Menucha Le B'Eilam Hazeh V'Le B'Eilam Haba Hilchim El Machayel El Choyel, which is clear that we're not talking about Tzaddikim and not Gan Eden. The aliyah is Behelam, and of course, when it comes to Geula, we'll see the aliyah for everybody. That's what we covered the first paragraph, and as I said, all the ha'ara is connected to that. So I'm going to then continue. Sorry?
Do the Shaman and Gan Eden and Tzaddikim see the aliyah in everyone, or they just see the aliyah in themselves?
The Rebbe's Lashon, El Pshagoli Nidazeh B'Neshamas B'Gan Eden. It's not talking about the Neshamas. He's saying that B'Goli, you see the aliyah in the Neshamas in Gan Eden. In other words, the Neshamas Gan Eden, they're Eila every day when they, through their limud HaTeira and their avavira. Basically, it's like when we say Elam Chatira B'Chayecha. So Gan Eden, things are B'Goli. I think I gave the example last week that Rebbe brings often from the Amoshel from the Alter Rebbe, but Rebbe Marash brings it, that what happens when we do a mitzvah down below, we know a mitzvah is Mishana the Chefza. That's the whole Chiddush of Matan Torah. So how come we don't see a shinui? Put on tefillin this morning, you see a shinui in the klaf? The answer is because our einei basar, our flesh, our eyes of flesh and blood, don't see the shinui. So where is the shinui? Where's the gili? So the answer is it's stored in Atzilus, kemunach v'kufsa as the example. So imagine you generate energy, but the energy is not revealed to everybody, but it's stored. It's like you're collecting it's like someone invests money and it's stored in a bank account, so to speak. So it's stored in Atzilus, munach v'kufsa, and then the Geula is not going to be a Chiddush. The Geula will simply be the Gili of Maseinu V'Avadeseinu B'Zman Hazeh, that all the mitzvahs that were done. So then, when you see Shinuyim in the world today, for example, technology or political freedoms, especially for Eden, so the Rebbe says that means opening your eyes and seeing that Elokus is, you see it in some way. But B'Shleimus, obviously, it'll be the Geula Mitzvah B'Shleimus. But in Gan Eden, is Gili Elokus L'Chatchila. You don't need to, it's only in Eilam Hazeh we don't see it. And Tzaddikim, he says, even in Eilam Hazeh you see their aliyahs mitamid, like he said, Mechayel El Chayil. Okay. Now continuing on. Va'af ki b'meshech shita alf shnin yeshnam kama shinuyim ba'aliyahs v'yeridus. And though during the course of the 6th millennia, shita alf shnin hava alma yesh kama shinuyim, there are changes in the aliyahs and yeridus, because it's not just one direction. Now he said aliyah achar aliyah, but we know it goes ups and downs. And the Rebbe on the ha'ara kama shinuyim, let's read the ha'ara. Rei chesed la'avram b'tchilase l'kutera v'eschana dibra masel v'yadaita perik dal v'biyurav. I think, if I recall correctly, I looked up the chesed la'avram, and at some point, L'Kutei Torah, what he says, I don't remember the Ches Avram, but I think it's the same Teichen, where the L'Kutei Torah says, the famous L'Kutei Torah V'Yadaita, where he talks about Pnimiyah Makif, Seva Mamala, that what is today Mamala, what is today Seva, tomorrow is Mamala. In other words, it's like climbing a mountain. So that which is above our heads today, and you climb higher, you're there. And then what's above your head is the next step. So basically, what you need a munah for in the beginning becomes yidiyah, and then the munah is in higher madregas. It's a constant seder aliyas. So the Rebbe says that kama shinuyim. So you have to know why he was medayik dafka the word shinuyim. He doesn't say it on aliyas v'yiridis, shinuyim. So shinuyim clearly indicate that there's a process here. I think the Chesed Avram says something similar, not in the language of Chassidus, but the same idea. But it would be good to look it up, and I don't remember now exactly what it says there. Okay. So the Rebbe is like saying af. What's the af? Because he just said that everything is not tnuah of aliyah achar aliyah. So, but you say the shinuyim, and the shinuyim is an aliyah v'yiridis. It's like ups and downs. So the Rebbe continues. Hari nemar kro. Hari omar kro, sorry. Shevi yipul tzadik v'kom. So the pasuk says, Shevi yipul tzadik v'kom. There's 7 levels of the tzaddik when he's climbing. So he falls. Yipul is a nefila, is a yirida. And then comes the v'kom. Sha'nefila b'shvil akima v'aliyah sh'achazeh. So the Rebbe is saying that even when there's the yirida is not an end in itself. The nefila is in order to bring the kima, the rising, and the aliyah that comes afterwards. V'nefila v'yirida zu muchrechasi. Okay, now the Rebbe is adding, this nefila v'yirida is muchrechasi. In the order he writes, Rei Sefer Agdom l'Shar Yichud v'Amuna. So in the Chanech Hanar, the introduction to Shar Yichud v'Amuna, he talks about Shevi Yipul Tzadik v'Kom, and he says it's also to Terei Bir l'Dibra Masel v'Shafti b'Sholem b'Sefer. Okay, so it says now Muchrechu. U'Kemavur b'Kam Mekemes Barucha. Asher bein Madrega HaKedemes l'Madrega Nailis Yeser Shacharei Tzarech Li is Bittul Be'emtza. So it's explained in a number of places Barucha. Does the Rebbe Zeichen? Yeah, he does, the Shari Eir. I'll read it in a moment. That what? That in the process of any growth, it's not just one direction, not just aliyah. There's always going to be, in the language like he says here, does he bring the language, the yesh, ayin, and yesh, yeah. That between every madrega, to a higher madrega, there has to be a bittul be'emtza. The gam b'seder ha'yiridim u'mayl lamata kenhu. So that's also true, not just mamat lamayl, but also mamayl lamata. In other words, when it's going from higher to lower, you also has to be with a leap. It's not just a regular smooth flow, a seamless flow. There's always going to be a leap. Asher bein yesh li yesh tzarich li is ayin be'emtza. Between yesh and yesh needs to be an ayin be'emtza. But remember, that's regarding bria. He talked, for example, you plant the seed in the ground. It's a famous example. The seed, as nirkav, deteriorates and decomposes before it grows into a sapling, which will ultimately grow into a whatever it may be, a flower, a tree, or whatever the vegetation is. That's in the process of growth. But the same is true mamat l'mayla, he's saying, in other words, in Ayurveda, that's a Shevi Yipul Tzadik v'Kom, that when a person climbs in Ayurveda, they want to go from one madriga to another. If it's, like so to speak, dargas that are erech zelazeh, so it's like ilavol, you don't need to have a leap necessarily. But if it's a darga shalei berech, then you have to have an ayin before you go to the next level. And that's why between every elam there's a parsa, or as Chassidus brings the Omid bein Gan Eden leGan Eden, or the Nahar Dinor, that Chassidus talks about Samach Vov and Ayin Beis in several places. So point being here is that Rebbe is adding now, before he just said that there's that the Yerida B'chalal is the Kavon Aliyah. And the harder that we learned, he talks about that Aliyah is for sure going to happen. But then it could go straight, or it can be sometimes you have to go through Lumazeh, like he said, and be Natseach the Ulumazeh. Al derech like a Baal Tshuva, compared to Tzaddik. But now the Rebbe says even more so, that even by Tzaddikim, Tzaddik Yipul Shevi Yipul Tzadik will come. But B'chlal, in Teva Adavarim, does he say the word Teva? He says, doesn't say the word Teva, but it's clear that Miridizu Muchrachasi. That means that even for a person who is not doing something Chas v'sholem, that's Hepech HaRotzen, you still have to have a Yerida. That's the Seder HaDvarim, because that's the way the Eibishter set up Seder Shtalshlos. That both Mamayl Lamata and Mamat Lamayl, there's always going to be a Ayin Be'emtzer. So this is even a person, as I said, who's Beicher always B'charta B'chaim and not doing anything wrong. Alachas Kam V'kam, even a person who does something wrong, he also said earlier that the Aliyah is also going to ultimately happen by him as well, even the Ish Prati. But the Rebbe added now that Yerida is, in other words, a part of the process. Even in the Seder of Aliyah, Mamat Lamayla, B'chayil Al-Choyel, you still need to have the Shevi Yipel. The Yipel will come with the Nefila being an introduction to the next Aliyah. For example, I don't think he brings it here. Chassidus asks the question why we say Tachnun after Shemoneh Esrei. B'cheira, Shemoneh Esrei is already the highest level in davening. By that point, we're already completely pure. So Tachnun should be said earlier, Vidui. Chassidus answers because once you finish Shemoneh Esrei, now you're Megala, new Madregas that are before were Behelim, like a Ra HaNelam, something much more Dakazdik. In other words, that which yesterday by you was an Aveda, was B'Shleimus, Aveda Tama, when you come to a higher Madrega, then everything becomes much more sensitive. So even things that yesterday was like was regular Aveda, now you have to be much more careful, because that's the Seder Aveda, because that's the process. When you're climbing, there's always going to be a point where you come to a point and you almost have to realize you have to go through an ayin to get to the next level. A famous classic example, Rab Zera, the Gemara in Bab Mitzir, Rab Zera fasted 40 fasts or 100 fasts between Talmud Bavli, to forget Talmud Bavli to learn Talmud Yerushalmi. Why did he have to fast? Why do you have to forget? Knowledge is accumulative. Because Bavli and Yerushalmi is completely two different drachim. One is Chezer, Er Yashar. So he didn't forget the ideas that he learned. You're not allowed to forget Torah. Intentionally, especially intentionally. Forgot the method. He wanted to forget the method. So there's an ayin. The fasting was like ayin between Bavli and Yerushalmi. Al derech dugma. And many other dugmois to explain that the process of Aliyas and Yeridus is part of the Muchreches he. Now why the Rebbe is emphasizing this, you could say perhaps that, remember he's talking here about his brother, Yisrael Aryeh Leib. I mean, the whole thing is around him. He had his challenges in his life. We don't know all his cheshbenis, and we don't know all the nisyanis, so I'm not going to go analyze it. But clearly the Rebbe is talking about a matzav like that. You see clearly he mentions Yerida all the time. So the fact of the matter is that every person in life is going to go through all the Yeridis. Even if, again, the Bechira is always perfect, even at Tzaddik. So the Rebbe is clearly emphasizing that this is a process that everyone's going to go through. Additionally, we learned earlier, there's also the issue of Bechira, where a person chooses or goes into a matzav, actually he's led into a matzav. Based on the Sefer HaMitzvos, it's mashma there that a person is put in that situation, a special nesoyin, in order to put himself at risk, in order to protect the military of his side, that they should be natseach. So there's mashma from the Derech Mitzvah, that's actually not even, he still chooses, like he said, the Rebbe says, he still is going to be nenash. He says, nenash habeichet, because that was not his kavanah. But why was he placed in a situation like that? That he should be in a situation where he should be exposed to l'umazeh. Just as an aside, I want to just bring this in before we continue. I once heard from people who were at the Fabring and the Rebbe in Tafshin Chavov, and also in Tafshin Chavhei and Chavov, Sukkos told a famous story, very controversial story of the Baal Shem Tov, with a sukkah that was questionable. So the story goes briefly, and the Rebbe tells the story that there was once in the Mezhebush, word got out that the Baal Shem Tov sukkah was not kosher l'chol hadayis, or upon him was a suffix whether it was completely kosher. And there was a kpeda. People were talking about it. Why build a sukkah that was not mamish pi halacha in every possible way. And then came a miracle, a piskim in Shemaya. They found that Settle from heaven came down and said that the sukkah is kosher. So the Rebbe asked the question, why did the Baal Shem Tov l'chatchila not build a perfect sukkah? Why did he build a sukkah that was not complete? That's an interesting sikha, both I think Chav Hei and Chavav, the Rebbe told the story. And the Kudus at the Teretz was because the Baal Shem Tov is Neshama Klolis, Nasi Adar, and he wanted to make sure that in case there's someone who's not sitting in a sukkah, in a proper sukkah, he's not sitting in an appropriate sukkah, so Baal Shem Tov, like so to speak, was being kail, he was like going into his matzav and being so-called protecting him. Like al derech when you say Maglin Rabbi Imei, that when a Talmud has to go to your miklat, you send the Rav with him. Why? The Rav is not shuldik, because the Rav is connected to his Talmud. Moshe Rabbeinu ended up staying in the Midbar with his people. It's like the captain stays with the ship. And the Rebbe, so to speak, is bound to his people. So the Moshe Rabbeinu, the Baal Shem Tov, therefore put himself in a situation that was somewhat questionable, so to speak, to be Megan Umatzel and to protect the Eden that were not sitting necessarily in a perfect sukkah. I heard from people who are the Fabring and Chavov that when the Rebbe told the story and explained it, he was crying uncontrollably. And people were wondering, and I don't know who said it, but someone told me that they think that Rebbe was talking about himself as well. That sometimes you put yourself in a matzav that from the outside it may seem that you're putting yourself in an asayan. I mean, al tevienu l'dei asayan. But nevertheless, you have to do it because a nasi, a leader, has to put himself sometimes in a sakana. I mean, al derech what it says in Bas Ligani, that when the melech is mevazbez kol ha'etzes for the netzach, it also says mashli chayav l'fanov. He goes out himself. Why does the melech have to go and put himself at risk? He sends soldiers. Because when you're dealing with netzach and you're dealing with a serious battle that needs to be won, the melech will put himself in sakana. So they were talking that the Rebbe, perhaps that was one, the Rebbe may have been referring to himself, or they went to college, or whatever the Rebbe did, so to speak, that some people may find questionable. The Rebbe was explaining that that was the reason. I'm just saying this as a hergish from some people who were there. The Rebbe didn't say it befedish, so don't necessarily say this I'm not saying this in any authoritative way. But it makes sense because if you go back to the story, the moshel in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, about the Balmum, where he says that what happens, a person's going out and putting himself in danger, in harm's way. But why is he doing it? Because he wants to draw the enemy to protect his others. There was a man, I don't want to say his name, from the early years in Tafshin Yud Aleph, the Rebbe sent him on a shlichus somewhere. It didn't work out. And he once called me to fabring with me about it. And he showed me all the letters of the Rebbe, how the Rebbe gave him brachas that'll be matzliach. And he was pasha crying. He says, my whole life is a failure. Because I was one of the first people that Rebbe sent on shlichus, and it didn't work. And I have all these letters and all these brachas. How do you explain it? To say you see shlichem aso matzliach. So I said, I can't answer these questions. Who knows? And then he said to me, the only way I can explain it, he said, I remember by World War II, when the Allies went on their attack, it's called Normandy, when they landed by the beach of France, and they began their counterattack against the Nazis. So the ships came with thousands of soldiers. The boats were coming, but a boat can't go right up to the water, to the beach, because it'll get grounded. So what happens is the first soldiers run out, and they run through the water, and some of them actually fall and die right there, and they become like a bridge for the other soldiers to be able to walk. So he says, maybe I was one of those Sel Azazels, that in the beginning, the first ones that run out, so the others can now walk on us, and we're the ones that, so to speak, somewhat like what he says in Sefer HaMitzvahs. Anyway, I'm just giving some dugmoyes because it's a very fascinating concept. Now, Chaz v'Shalom, I want to make sure this is clear. Echtev Oshev is not a Seder. Chaz v'Shalom is that someone should say, I'm going to do that, I'm going to fall, and I'm going to do something, Chaz v'Shalom, that's questionable. Because as I said, Al Tavienu L'dei Nesayin. You're talking about a Rebbe, a Baal Shem Tov. A Rebbe knows what he's doing. There's a matzav where he has to put himself in that type of situation. Anyway, so again, this is a little pirushim and teresh bal peh and hergeshim in what the Rebbe's kavana is. I'm not going to say this is definitive, the intention, but it's pretty clear when you read it all that this is what comes out from it. Okay. So we've established now, this next paragraph, that the aliyas and yeridus are mukhrech. Yiridazu mukhrechasi rather. Because both mamata lamata, you need to have, darga ledarga, you need an ayin be'emtza. Which explains how you jump both from the top down and bottom up. Oh, how do you make a paradigm shift? How can you leap? And the only way is like the Rab Zeira Shikha, you have to have some ayin. The ayin is going to be a yerida. On its own, it's a yerida. But it's a Hagdama, the Nefila is a Hagdama to the next aliyah. That's the addition in the next paragraph. Let me continue. The Rebbe says now, V'zeu she'omer HaBaal Shem Tov. By the way, the ayin be'emtze, the Rebbe Zeichens, as I said, Shara Eira, da Yevish V'yilevush, Perich of Dal Ve'elech, that's a famous Shara Eira that talks about Yesh Ayin and Yesh. And Hemshech Rosh Hashanah Tovshin Yud Aleph, Tofris Tzadik Dalet. Hemshech Tzadik Dalet, Perich Beis Ve'elech, will become Mekayim. Okay. Then the Rebbe continues, V'zeu she'omer HaBaal Shem Tov, and this is what the Baal Shem Tov said. The Rebbe brings it from Ayin Beis, the Chele Gimel. And look at the Sikha Yutas Kristo Samardal. What did the Baal Shem Tov say? Sha'af she'yachol hulales b'sara hashamayma. The Baal Shem Tov said, before his istalkos, that even though he can go up b'sara hashamayma, like Eliyahu Novi, in other words, not go through El Ofer Toshav, but b'sara hashamayma, go up on like a wind, a storm that leads him up to heaven. K'mo Eliyahu Hanovi, reitzu hulavir durgein, ha'inyan devel Ofer Toshav. He wants to durgein, wants to go through the passage of El Ofer Toshuv. Oferat El Ofer Toshuv, which means to be buried. It's an interesting statement. V'hainu, ki ha'yirida ha'yesed tachtein El Ofer Toshuv. Ha'choni hi lemadregi yesed nailus masher aliyah b'sara hashamayma. The Rebbe is explaining. Why does he want to go through El Ofer Toshuv? If you can go straight to heaven, why do you have to go through earth? So he says, because the Yidas Yesed Tachteinu, which is Ofer Toshav, Mamish doesn't get lower than that, is Achonah to the highest Madrega, higher than Aliyah B'Sara Shamayma. So Sara Shamayma is Taka High Madrega. Eliyahu Novi went straight. He never so-called passed away. His Neshama went straight to heaven with his goof. But Baal Shem Tov wanted to Dafka go through Ofer Toshav. So it's even more here. Not just there's a Ayin Be'emtze, Sheva Yipul Tzadik V'kom, a yipul, a nefila, it's actually a rida, a yesed tachteina, but it's a achana to go to a higher level. Now this is an interesting beard in the story of the Baal Shem Tov, and why the Rebbe brings it here. I mean, Pashtus is talking to a person that just passed away, Rabbi Solari Leib. So clearly the connection to Allah for Toshav. But it's interesting how he explains it in this context. V'kiven sha'yirida hachana muchrechesi la'aliyah lemadregi yesa nailas. Listen to this chiddush now. And since the yirida is muchreches, because that's what the Ebershter had eingestellt in Seder Abriya, you can't go from Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi without some yirida. You can't go from any madrega to another madrega without some yipul tzadik v'kom. Hari be'emes ein ze yirida. Kim chelik min aliyah nailas yeser. So since the Ebershter built it in, so even though to our eye it may look like Yerida on that for a moment, but it's part of the whole process. Al derech when we say Seisam Nas Livnes. So you see, they raise a building with a Z. You know, you destroy a building in order to build a better building in its place. So if you just came there when they destroyed the building, you'd think, destruction. It's a churban. But then you come and you realize, no, they're taking it down in order to build something. So the Yisayser is not a Seiser at all. It's a step in the binyan. Just like if you have to shed one layer of skin to get another layer of skin. So just because right now, momentarily, it appears like something is disappearing, you know, children, baby teeth fall out and then their big teeth, adult teeth grow in, it's not falling out, it's all part of the process of Aliyah. This is one of the Rebbe's chidushim you'll find in a lot of sikhs, but this is already Tafshin Yud, this is back in Tafshin Yud days. So it's for the first time maybe the Rebbe said it beferish. It talks a lot about the 3 weeks, that Yerida Tzedek Aliyah is not just there's a Yerida that is the Tzedek Aliyah, but the Yerida is a chelik of the Aliyah. And the Aliyah, to have the Aliyah, you must have the Yerida. That's what the Rebbe is adding here. So it's somewhat consistent with what he said in the beginning, when he said, V'akavona, that Shekeni Kavona Elyena Harinasa came bepeil. So there he was saying that the Aliyah is for sure going to happen because that's the Kavona. Amima Akab B'yadeh, and it's all part of the process. But here he's going even further. Not just that there's going to be an aliyah in the end, but the whole yerida is a chelik of the aliyah. Ein ze yerida, the Rebbe says. Kim chelik min aliyah nailis yeser. So if you really think about it, in life, when you have a setback, so you could say it's a setback, okay, but you know that it's a springboard for further growth. But if you say even more than that, that the setback itself is part of the growth, that means it's not a yerida b'chlal. It's part of the growth. It's a whole different way of looking b'chlal at life. Because even the downside, even things that may seem negative, are really part of a bigger picture. The Rebbe speaks about this in Yehovchu Yom Meil L'Sosan L'Simcha. Why is it Yehovchu? It doesn't say it will just be bittul of the tzemis. It'll be Yehovchu Yom Meil L'Sosan L'Simcha. Because Yehovchu, because the Kavanah Primis is, that's why it's called the Eis Rotzen, Eis Tainus. Because the Kavanah of it is the Aliyah. Right now, we only see the Chesenius of it, so we only see the Tainus. But in truth, in Primis, it's really all Aliyah. Now he goes back and brings it back to the parsha of the Ptira and the Avelis. V'cheinu b'chlolis inyan ha-Ptira v'Avelis. And so is it, b'chlolis in general, with the Ptira, when someone passes away, and Avelis, and sitting Shiva, the mourning, the grieving over it. So the Rebbe says like this, few things. B'negei ha-niftar, regarding the person who passed away, ha-Ptira hi inyan have el efer toshuv b'shvil aliyah yesenai l'shachar kach. So what's the yin of Ptira? We know that the Chetei Tzadas was the cause for death, for Misa. Had they not eaten from Eitz Hadas, it says they would have lived forever. So l'cheir it's a neinish, and therefore only a yerida. So no, the Rebbe says it's not the case. Ptira is in order to create el efer toshuv b'shvil aliyah yesenai l'shachar kach. In other words, the Rebbe is applying what the Baal Shem Tov says to his brother. He's even saying b'chlal p'tira v'avelis, which means you could apply it to everybody, which is also an interesting chiddush. Usually you think the Baal Shem Tov. Now the chiddush is the Baal Shem Tov could have gone b'sar hashemayim, the rest of human beings can't. That's the chiddush. But b'peil mamish, what we learn from the story of the Baal Shem Tov is that every time there's a p'tira, and there's the elof toshuv is b'shvil ali yesenai l'shachar kach. So even though it is chatchila, the cause of elof toshuv is because of the Chetei Tzadas, but b'peil mamish, it's a yerida that's not an end in itself, because we know in Torah there's no such thing as an einish l'shem einish. That too is part of the aliyah. Okay, that's b'negei the nifter. What about the negela avelim? B'negei avelim, which the Rebbe, including himself, he sat shiva for his brother. Yivodlu l'chaim tevim. So he says, inyan havelish shehu meichen de katnus. So it says in Chassidus, the Rebbe Tzeichen is meichen de katnus. Actually, Tzeichen the Shara Mitzvahs of the Arizal, Pasha Vayechi. 1 second. Yeah. So he says like this, B'negei avelim, avelis is a meichen de katnus. That means a yerida, like Yipul. Meichen de katnus, he explains in Kabbalah, Chassidus brings it as well, that meichen de gadlus is when you're expansive. Time of simcha is a time of meichen de gadlus. Meichen de katnus is when the meichen is betzimtzum, when a person is more, I would say, farkvetched, or a person is more limited. The gili is more of a limited one, so the Rebbe says that too. He gamken b'shvil aliyah lemadregi yesenai l'shachar. So the whole theme that the Rebbe was speaking till now about Yerida Tzedek Aliyah, Yerida is a chelik of the Aliyah, is both b'negei the nifter, and both b'negei the avelim. Because the avelim also are going through a Yerida when they sit Shiva and they are grieving and mourning over the nifter. But it's also the madrega, it's a b'shvil aliyah lemadregi yesenai l'shachar. V'yesh leimer, the Rebbe now adds, Shezeu gam kemeteichen haromuz b'loshen hanachama. Yeshlemi, you could say this is also the teichen, the content that's hinted to in the lashon when we menachem someone. Shekelim ha'ovel b'teich avli tzim v'Yerushalayim. We say Amoki menachem eschem b'teich sha'avli tzim v'Yerushalayim. So the Rebbe says, so in the lashon hanachama we keilah the oval b'teich avli tzim v'Yerushalayim, and everyone knows what's the connection. So there's a lot of biyurim. So the Rebbe says, Ki madregas Mashiach ובייס המקדש השלישי הם נעלים הרבה יסר מהמדרגה שקדם החורבן. Because the level of Mashiach and the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi and the third temple, the third Beis Hamikdash, are much higher. He brings from Eitz Chaim, from Hemshav V'Kocha, from the way it was Kedem HaChurban. Even though the Churban was a Yerida. But the Churban is again a chelik of the Aliyah that will lead to Mashiach and the Gula Amitis Vashlema Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi. Mashiach nailed Berega Tukufo Lerega HaChurban. And when is Mashiach nailed, we know, Miyad. The famous Medrash, Kumesupa Be'echa Rabba, the Rebbe brings that. That Goa Parosei, that he saw the farmer, the Arab farmer, and first the cow groaned, and he said, your Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. And then it groaned again, he says, and nailed Mashiach Shal Yisrael. When was that? Tisha B'Av in the afternoon. That's why we say Nachim then. So what do you see from this? Mashiach is born in the Rega. That means in the Rega of the Churban, you already have the Geula coming. The birth of Mashiach. That means immediately, to the lowest level, when the flames of highest, Tisha B'Av afternoon, right then, immediately, not before the Churban, which I don't think emphasizes that it's Dafka the Churban that leads to the latest Mashiach. Why? Mashiach could have been born a day before Tisha B'Av, or earlier Tisha B'Av. Says no. But take the Gula begins right then. Kemuvan, it's not the Gula Amitzvah Hashem Begoli, but the process began immediately. So you see here again how the Yerida is a chelik of the Aliyah. And that's why we say B'teich Avli Tzim Yerushalayim, because just like the Avli Tzim Yerushalayim sat Shiva, so to speak, and they mourned the Beis Hamikdash, the destruction of Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni, and they will be, and their nechama will be through the Mashiach and Gula. So the same thing, every Yachid is Nichlol B'teich Avli Tzim Yerushalayim, Hamokim Yenachem Eschen, the Avelim that go through their Yerida, Mechan the Katniss is also B'shvil the higher Aliyah. And then the Rebbe concludes, a person, however, needs a tremendous amount of effort and exertion and aveda. Because if this is so simple, so why is life so difficult? He says, because you need aveda yigiyah. I'm sorry, yigiyah rabba v'aveda until there be this level. Shiva shebe'es hanefila v'ayiridi yargishu b'peil. That in order to be able to feel, actually sense and feel, that during the nefila and the yirida, which we just said is part of the aliyah. So l'chayr, if that's the case, we should all feel good about it. He says no. That during the nefila yirida, you should feel b'peil, v'reilak l'haimin or l'hovin. Not just to believe and understand. In other words, you could believe that the aliyah is part of the aliyah. L'hovin, you could understand it also. Makes sense, al pi seichel. But lahargish, that takes a lot of aveda. That this yerida, and we see b'peil, when a person is, God forbid, in a matzav of tzad, avelim, you can't just say to them, hey, you know what, this is a big simcha here, because this is all part of the gula. So to feel that, not just to believe and to understand how it's only hachana muchrachas, means a necessary preparation and step toward this is aveda, again, yigiyah rabba, tzorich adam yigiyah rabba v'aveda. V'zeh tzorich li is gam ken kavanas hamanachim. And this should also be the kavanah of those that are being menachem over, those that are coming and consoling and comforting. The oval, the avelim, kirak, that has to be part of their kavanah. But pasta, this means that the menachemim have to help the avelim come to understand or feel this. Because only through this can you really be truly consoled. In other words, you can console someone and tell them everything's going to be good. But the true nechama, the Rebbe says, is dafke when you know it's part of an aliyah, and not just, even though right now it's a very painful yerida. B'teich shar avlitzim v'Yerushalayim. That's how the Rebbe concludes this Rishima. Together with the shar avlitzim v'Yerushalayim. So that's what the Menachemim do, to try to help the person come to that level of feeling. And the Ha'ara the Rebbe adds, Le'nochem be'emes, interesting, he writes, Yi'un Seif Makas, look at the end of Makish, says, Simen l'churban ha'yeser godel dafke. Now what's the siman for the greatest churban? Shul, haklipis, the shul that when they saw the shualim, Helchim in the place of the Kodesh Kedoshim, that was a siman, the worst possible thing. Because you're talking about the Holy of Holies, because the shul, he says, the Rebbe says, is the side of klippus, me'er e'er, and where dafke shul me'beis Kodesh HaKadoshim. They saw a shul in the Holy of Holies. So Eirer Hashchek Shel Rabbi Akiva. Dafke that awakened and stimulated the smile of Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara and Makkos, where the other Tanoim were crying when they saw the Churban. And Rabbi Akiva was smiling. And then they said, Akiva Nechamtoni, Akiva Nechamtoni. V'omer Lechachomim Nechamtono, Akiva Nechamtono. So you see from this why it's the Nichum Be'emes. That's what the Rebbe writes, the Nochem Be'emes. Because Rabbi Akiva was able to be margish. He felt that gili. Even though he also sat Shiva for the Churban Beis HaMikdash on Tisha B'Av Pashtus. And with that, the Rebbe concludes this Rishima. So there's a lot that you can read into this. There's so much depth here, and both in the Sugis and Chassidus, but also the Rebbe saying all this in connection to his brother. As I said last year, this is like maybe the only thing we have where the Rebbe speaks directly. There is Sichas later in Memhei, speaks about his brother's name, Yisrael Ari Leib. But this is Mamash Rishima that the Rebbe said and wrote right after he stood up from Shiva. So there's a lot that can be read into this, and how he's honoring his brother, and also talking about the Avelim B'chlal. It's also, I mean, Le'aleinu, nobody should ever know, but if you ever go to a Shiva call, and unfortunately there's some people, I just went myself yesterday to a few Shiva calls, so it's a very powerful Rishima to quote, to explain a little how we understand what Shiva is, what Avelim are, and also the ultimate, the Rebbe says, Klar, that's the Kavonas HaMenachemim. So we have also, again, should be no more, should be mochadim al kol ponim, and we shouldn't have any more of these things. So this will only see the aliyah and the gula mitis v'ashlema. Okay. Good.